It happened on a quiet New York subway. An elderly woman's scream shattered the silence as a thief tore her purse away. Passengers froze, afraid to move. But one man stood up. It wasn't a cop. It wasn't a soldier. It was Keanu Reeves, and what he did next would change every soul on that train forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The city that never sleeps was winding down, but the subway never did. It groaned through tunnels like a living machine, carrying home the last few souls of the night. The fluorescent lights flickered in rhythm with the rails, painting pale reflections on the metal walls. It was nearly midnight when Keanu Reeves stepped onto the train at Times Square station, wearing a simple gray coat and a faded baseball cap pulled low. To the world, he was a star. But here, in the quiet hum of the underground, he was just another tired passenger heading home. He found an empty seat near the middle of the car, across from a man reading a newspaper and a college girl scrolling on her phone. No one looked twice at him. That was how he preferred it. The night after filming was always the same. His mind, half in the story he'd lived on set, half in the silence that followed. The movie lights had faded, but the images still played behind his eyes. A scene of chaos, rescue, redemption. But this train, this real world, was calm, at least for now. The doors shut with a hollow clang, and the train lurched forward. Keanu leaned back and exhaled. The air was dry and faintly metallic, tinged with the scent of oil and concrete. He noticed a young man in a hoodie pacing by the door, restless, tapping his fingers against a metal pole. Two others sat near him, whispering and glancing down the aisle. Their energy felt wrong, too alert, too sharp for an hour, when most people could barely keep their eyes open. Keanu's instincts were quiet but alive. Decades of walking through the darker corners of the world on screen and off had taught him to read people, to feel danger before it happened. He didn't react. Not yet. Instead, he glanced around the car. A nurse in scrubs dozed near the window, her head against the glass. A delivery driver with grease-stained hands clutched a paper bag of leftovers. Life was moving homeward in slow motion. The rhythm of the train carried them through the tunnels like a lullaby. But beneath that lullaby, there was something else, a note out of place, a sound of tension that only a few could hear. The tapping of shoes, the subtle exchange of nods between the restless figures, and the faint buzz of adrenaline in the air. Keanu didn't know what was coming, but he could feel it building. Like a storm just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to break. He took a quiet breath and closed his eyes for a moment, not in sleep, but in awareness. He was tired, yes, but not unaware. In the city's underbelly, anything could happen, and that night, it would. The train rattled through the dark tunnel, the motion rocking everyone gently in their seats. Keanu kept his eyes half open, his gaze drifting from face to face. He wasn't looking for trouble, but something about the air felt heavier now. The pacing man had stopped near the doors, pretending to check his phone. Every few seconds, his eyes flicked toward the far end of the car where an older woman sat with a shopping bag at her feet. A faint hum from the train masked the whisper of voices. Two men, sitting opposite the pacing one, were muttering to each other in low tones. Keanu caught pieces of their conversation, fragments like easy grab and next stop. He couldn't be sure what they meant, but his gut told him it wasn't good. He adjusted his seat slightly, angling himself so he could see all three of them in his peripheral vision. Years of stunt work had taught him how to observe without being noticed, how to read a room or a train car without making anyone aware. These weren't hardened criminals, he thought. They looked too young, too uncertain, but desperation could be just as dangerous. The nurse near the window stirred in her sleep, her head jerking up as the train screeched around a bend. The sound echoed off the steel walls like a shriek, startling the college girl across from Keanu. She looked up, then quickly back to her phone, pretending nothing had happened. Fear wasn't loud here, it lived in silence. Everyone saw, but no one wanted to get involved. A faint announcement crackled through the speakers. Next stop, 81st Street. The train began to slow, lights flashing across the windows. Keanu's attention sharpened as the three men exchanged glances again. He noticed one of them shift his body slightly toward the older woman. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention. But to Keanu, it was a signal, a quiet, deliberate move that spoke of intent. He straightened in his seat, his hands resting loosely on his knees. No tension yet, just readiness. The car rocked again, and the older woman looked up with a soft, tired smile. She was maybe in her 70s, wearing a long wool coat and clutching her purse close to her chest. Her hair was silver and tied neatly in a bun. She seemed harmless, invisible even, to the kind of young men who thought the world owed them something. The doors opened at 81st Street. A few passengers stepped out, 2 more entered. The pacing man didn't move, neither did Keanu. The doors slid shut again with a hiss, and the train continued deeper into the night. Keanu glanced up at the tunnel, lights flashing past the window. They reminded him of camera flashes, but this wasn't a movie. There were no retakes, no stunt coordinators, no scripts to follow. Whatever was coming next, it would be real, and in that moment, he felt it again, the unmistakable pull of fate about to test him once more. The train's rhythm deepened as it left the station behind. Each clatter of the wheels echoed like a heartbeat through the metal floor. Keanu looked up at the digital display above the door. Next stop, 96th Street. Another 7 minutes of tunnel darkness. The lights flickered, briefly dimming, and a faint murmur ran through the car. People always feared the flicker, as if it reminded them how fragile their safety really was underground. Keanu's gaze shifted again toward the group near the door. The pacing man had stopped completely now, standing still, but tense. His hands were shoved in his pockets, his jaw tight. The other 2 men whispered quickly, eyes darting toward the older woman again. She seemed unaware, lost in her own thoughts, quietly humming to herself. Her voice was gentle, almost comforting against the mechanical groan of the train. It made the danger feel even more cruel in contrast. A paper cup rolled down the aisle, hitting Keanu's boot. It must have fallen from someone's bag when the train swayed. He bent down, picked it up, and set it on the empty seat beside him. The small motion drew the pacing man's eyes for a brief second. Keanu held his gaze calm, steady, unreadable. For that single instant, the energy between them shifted. The man looked away, pretending disinterest, but Keanu could see the flicker of unease beneath the surface. At the far end, the college girl finally glanced up from her phone. She noticed the tension too. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the 3 men, then flicked toward Keanu. She didn't recognize him, not fully, just sensed that he was someone who wouldn't sit idle. Her fingers tightened on her backpack strap, as if holding her own line of defense. The nurse stirred again, rubbing her eyes and letting out a weary sigh. The air in the car felt thicker now, the kind that pressed on the lungs before something broke. Keanu leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his expression thoughtful but alert. He had no desire to play the hero, not unless he had to. But life had a way of putting him in places where doing nothing wasn't an option. A metallic rattle sounded from the coupling between cars. The lights dimmed again. For a moment, the train was bathed in a dull orange glow from emergency bulbs. The faces around him appeared like ghostly silhouettes, worried eyes, lowered heads, silent fear. Then, as quickly as it came, the light returned to its harsh white hum. The group near the door shifted again. One of the men nodded toward the elderly woman, and the pacing man adjusted his stance. Keanu felt his pulse slow, his body settling into quiet readiness. No one else seemed to notice, or maybe they didn't want to. The train sped on through the endless black tunnel, unaware it was carrying the first sparks of a storm. Keanu's eyes stayed locked on the movement ahead, the faint echo of destiny beginning to whisper through the clatter of steel and track. The train slowed again as it approached 96th Street. The brakes screeched against the rails, and a brief gust of cold air filled the car as the doors opened. From the platform stepped an elderly woman clutching a paper grocery bag in one arm and a worn leather purse in the other. Her coat was buttoned to her neck, a knitted scarf wrapped carefully beneath her chin. She moved with the slow precision of someone who had learned to balance fragility with pride. Her name was Margaret. She hesitated at the door, looking for a place to sit. The car was nearly full now, though most avoided eye contact, heads bowed toward glowing screens. Keanu stood quietly, offering his seat with a small gesture. Margaret smiled, surprised by the kindness. "Thank you, dear," she said softly. Her voice carried a warmth that filled the space between them. Keanu nodded, replying with a gentle smile before sitting across from her. He noticed the faint tremor in her hands as she set the grocery bag on the floor. A carton of milk peeked from the top, alongside a loaf of bread and a bouquet of daisies wrapped in thin plastic. She adjusted the flowers delicately, as if afraid they might wilt from the city's chill. The lights flickered again, drawing a sigh from one of the passengers. Margaret didn't seem bothered. She looked around with quiet curiosity, taking in the young woman nodding off with earbuds in, the father holding a sleeping child, the man across the aisle, pretending to read a newspaper he hadn't turned a page of in 10 minutes. It was the kind of gentle awareness that came from a lifetime of watching people, not judging them. Keanu's gaze softened. Margaret reminded him of his mother not in appearance, but in spirit. That quiet dignity, that calm resilience built through years of hardship and love. He remembered nights sitting at the kitchen table, listening to his mother hum while paying bills she could barely afford. Margaret had that same kind of light, a quiet strength, disguised as gentleness. But at the far end of the car, 3 pairs of eyes were fixed on her. The pacing man and his companions hadn't missed her arrival. The purse she held close was old, the leather cracked, but it looked heavy. One of them whispered something, a quick grin flashing, before it disappeared. Keanu caught the movement. He felt his chest tighten slightly. The energy in the car shifted subtle, but unmistakable. Margaret leaned back against her seat, her purse resting on her lap. She looked out the window at the passing darkness, unaware of the danger that had started to circle her. For her, this was just another late train ride home. For Keanu, it was becoming something else entirely, a moment of decision, forming quietly in the dark. The train doors closed again, sealing the passengers inside the dimly lit car. The rhythm of the tracks returned, steady and hypnotic. Margaret adjusted the strap of her purse, pressing it gently against her chest. It wasn't filled with much, just her wallet, an old photograph of her late husband, a few dollar bills, and a small pouch of coins. But to her, it held her life. Every belonging inside carried a story. She looked across the car, her eyes landing briefly on Keanu. There was something familiar about his stillness, something calm and grounded. She couldn't place him, though. To her, he was just a kind stranger in a gray coat, someone who offered his seat without expecting anything in return. She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth creasing with warmth, then turned her gaze back to the window. Keanu watched her with quiet respect. There was a fragility to her, but also grace. The world often ignored people like Margaret, those who had lived long enough to be invisible. He felt a pang of sadness thinking about that. She reminded him of the women who used to wave at him from porches when he was young, the ones who always had candy in a bowl and stories about a world that moved slower. A small sound broke his thoughts, a metallic click, faint but sharp. The pacing man had leaned against the door again, tapping a ringed finger against the metal bar. It was an idle motion, but his eyes told a different story. They flicked from Margaret's purse to his companions and back again. The man beside him, wearing a black beanie, gave a subtle nod. Keanu's senses heightened. The air felt tighter now, the train suddenly smaller. His gaze followed every twitch, every whispered exchange. He noticed how one of them kept checking the reflection in the train's window, using it like a mirror to see who was watching. Margaret shifted slightly in her seat, unaware of the silent observation. She opened her grocery bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a list, her handwriting neat but trembling. Milk, eggs, flowers for John, it read at the top. Keanu saw the flowers beside her and realized she must have just come from the cemetery. A widow, still keeping promises long after they were broken by time. As she refolded the list and tucked it back inside her coat, the man in the hoodie took a step closer. Just one step, but it was enough. Keanu's muscles tensed. He didn't move. Not yet. But his eyes sharpened, like a hunter's before the leap. The subway's lights dimmed once more, leaving the car in a pulse of shadow. Margaret didn't flinch. She clasped her hands over her purse, humming softly under her breath. It was a lullaby. A melody from another lifetime, when the world was gentler. And while she hummed, danger took one quiet step closer. The lullaby faded as the train rattled deeper underground, the hum of the wheels echoing through the car. Margaret adjusted her scarf again and leaned forward to pick up her grocery bag. The flowers shifted slightly, their bright yellow petals catching the light for just a moment before the tunnel swallowed the color back into gray. Across from her, Keanu's eyes never wavered. He noticed the man in the hoodie shift his weight from one foot to the other. It was a subtle signal, but Keanu caught it. Another of the men, sitting near the corner, stretched his arms and glanced down the aisle as if measuring the distance to the exit. They were preparing. He could see it in the tightening of their shoulders, the restless flicker in their eyes. Margaret looked around the car, smiling faintly at the young college girl who now met her gaze. The girl smiled back, though nervously, before returning to her phone. Keanu saw the brief exchange. It was human, ordinary, a small spark of kindness in the midst of growing tension. It reminded him what was at stake, not just a purse or a crime, but the fragile peace ordinary people carried with them through each day. The train began to slow again as the speaker crackled. Next stop, 103rd Street. The air pressure shifted, the sound of wind rushing past the car. Margaret reached for her grocery bag, unaware that every movement she made was being tracked by the men near the door. Her purse slipped slightly, its strap dangling near her knee. Keanu's eyes followed it, then flicked up to the man's. Their gazes met, one full of intent, the other a silent warning. Keanu didn't move, not yet. Timing was everything. Acting too soon could put Margaret in more danger. He steadied his breathing, waiting for the right moment. The train jolted slightly as it entered the station. Margaret adjusted her purse again and looked up at the sign, squinting through the glass. She wasn't getting off yet. The man in the hoodie exhaled slowly. His companion leaned closer and whispered something that only Keanu could half hear something about next one. Then the doors opened, and the faint sound of footsteps and distant street noise poured in. A few passengers exited, including the sleepy nurse and the father with the child. The car grew quieter, emptier, more isolated. Margaret sighed, gazing down at her flowers. "John would have loved these," she murmured under her breath, too softly for anyone but Keanu to catch. The tenderness in her voice struck him deeply. He thought of his own losses, the faces he could never bring back. The doors closed again with a metallic thud, and the train moved forward. Margaret sat back down, purse secure, unaware that in the shadows just a few seats away, danger was waiting patiently for the moment she least expected it. Keanu leaned back, jaw tight, eyes forward. Whatever was coming, he would be ready. The sound of steel against steel filled the subway car as it plunged deeper into the tunnels. The lights overhead flickered again, washing the faces of the passengers in alternating flashes of pale white and darkness. The tension that had been simmering was no longer invisible. It pulsed quietly through the air, like electricity waiting for release. The young man in the hoodie began to move again. His pacing was deliberate now, his steps echoing faintly on the metal floor. Each stride carried a restless energy, like a caged animal testing the bars. He rubbed his hands together, eyes darting toward Margaret's purse, then away, then back again. Sweat glistened on his forehead despite the chill of the train car. Keanu noticed every detail. The man's jaw clenched, his breath shallow, his fingers trembling not with fear but with hunger and guilt. Keanu had seen that look before, the face of someone cornered by life itself. It wasn't pure malice that drove this kind of desperation. It was survival twisted by circumstance. But that didn't make it any less dangerous. The other two men exchanged looks. One gave a small nod, a subtle sign of readiness. The pacing man hesitated, glancing toward the front of the car where the driver's compartment was sealed off. Then his gaze returned to the elderly woman. Margaret sat quietly, her purse still resting on her lap, humming again to herself, unaware that she had become the center of every tense heartbeat in the car. A teenage boy sitting nearby shifted uncomfortably, noticing the man's movement. He nudged his friend, whispering something. Both looked toward Keanu, who sat motionless, his eyes calm but alert. The boy must have sensed something about him. Maybe it was the stillness, the quiet authority that radiated without words. The subway car rocked as it took a sharp turn. The sudden motion made Margaret's grocery bag tip slightly, a carton of milk rolling to the edge. The pacing man flinched at the noise, then quickly looked away, trying to hide his nerves. Keanu caught that too. His instincts sharpened. The storm was building. For a brief moment, the train entered a stretch of perfect darkness where the lights dimmed almost completely. The sound of the wheels filled the void. In that shadow, Keanu could feel it, the invisible shift that precedes action, the moment before a storm breaks. Every sense in his body focused. The scent of metal, the hum of the train, the rhythm of uneven breathing across the aisle. It all told him one thing: the night wasn't done testing him. The tunnel stretched on endlessly, the darkness outside the windows broken only by fleeting flashes of light. The young man's reflection appeared and disappeared in the glass like a ghost, his movements jerky and uncertain. His right hand twitched at his side, brushing the edge of his hoodie pocket. Keanu followed that hand closely. It wasn't just nervousness, it was decision-forming. The two other men, his companions, pretended not to watch, but they were ready. One leaned back casually, arms crossed, eyes half closed. But every so often, his gaze darted toward the old woman's seat. The other pretended to look at his phone, though the screen had long gone dark. They weren't strangers to each other. They were synchronized in silence, bound by the same unspoken motive. Margaret shifted slightly, pulling her purse closer. Her instincts, though dulled by age, still whispered caution. She looked up at the pacing man, offered a polite smile, then turned back toward her grocery bag. The young man froze, caught off guard by her kindness. For a moment, he looked almost ashamed. But the shame was fleeting. It couldn't survive the hunger in his stomach or the weight of whatever debts haunted him. Keanu leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, his body language quiet but strong. He didn't want to intervene too early, but the tension in the air had a rhythm he recognized. It was like watching a fuse burn toward a charge. You could measure it by the breaths, by the widening eyes of bystanders who pretended not to see. At the far end of the car, the college girl from earlier noticed too. Her fingers hovered above her phone screen, uncertain whether to record or to run. Fear crept into her face as she looked at Margaret, then at the pacing man. She bit her lip, lowering her head, her pulse visible at her throat. A loud screech from the wheels jolted the car again. Margaret gripped the metal pole beside her for balance. The lights above flickered once more, longer this time, until the world around them seemed to flicker between shadow and light, like an old film reel. Every heartbeat felt slower, heavier. The young man finally stopped pacing. His feet planted near the door, he looked directly at Margaret, his jaw tightened. Keanu could see the conflict written across his face, a war between conscience and desperation. The other two men gave the faintest nods, like silent devils perched on his shoulders. And then, for the first time, Keanu saw the young man's eyes clearly. They weren't cruel, they were frightened. Whatever pushed him toward this path wasn't greed, it was despair. That realization struck Keanu harder than any threat could, because now he understood the truth. This wasn't just a crime about to happen. This was a cry for help, wearing the mask of danger. The lights steadied for a moment as the train roared through the tunnel, the metal floor vibrating beneath their feet. Keanu stayed still, his body relaxed, but ready, his mind quietly studying every detail. The young man's eyes flicked toward the older woman again, and the muscles in his face twitched, revealing the storm inside him. He wanted to walk away, but the other two were watching, urging him on without words. Margaret sat peacefully, humming softly again, unaware that she had become the center of the car's invisible battle. Her hands, thin and veined, rested on her purse. She turned her gaze toward the flickering advertisements above the window, her lips moving faintly as she read them simple things about toothpaste, local clinics, and winter coats on sale. Ordinary life flashing by, just as danger crept closer behind her. Keanu noticed the shift in the man's stance, the forward lean, the tightening of his shoulders. He had seen that motion countless times in training, on movie sets, and once or twice in life when situations turned real. It was the motion of someone about to act. The air seemed to hold its breath. 2 rows back, a middle-aged man pretending to sleep cracked one eye open, sensing something wrong. He met Keanu's gaze, uncertain, then looked quickly away. Everyone could feel it now, the unease that rippled through the confined space. But fear made them still. No one wanted to be the first to move. The train plunged into another section of tunnel, and for several seconds, the lights flickered so wildly that the world seemed to blink in and out of existence. Every flash revealed a frozen snapshot. Margaret, clutching her purse, the young man stepping forward, Keanu watching with cold focus, the college girl with her phone shaking in her hands. Then came silence. The train entered full darkness for just a heartbeat. No light, no sound but the wheels grinding against the rails. And in that instant, Keanu heard it, the faint scrape of a shoe against metal, the sharp intake of breath, the whisper of fabric moving too quickly. When the lights snapped back on, the young man was only a few feet from Margaret, his body tense, his right hand half raised. But he hesitated again. Something in Keanu's eyes stopped him cold. The young man's gaze met his across the aisle, a silent exchange, heavy and wordless. Keanu didn't need to speak. The look in his eyes said everything. Don't do this. The train rattled on, unaware of the lives balanced on a single choice. Margaret remained blissfully unaware, straightening the rudder, flowers in her grocery bag, as if nothing had changed. The storm had not yet broken, but the thunder was coming. Keanu leaned slightly forward, every sense on edge. He knew what was about to happen. The darkness had stirred, and it would not stay still for long. The next few seconds unfolded in silence so thick it felt alive. The tunnel outside the windows was pitch black, and the steady rhythm of the train masked the tension that had reached its breaking point. Keanu's eyes never left the young man, who now stood frozen near Margaret's seat, trembling between hesitation and impulse. The 2 other men gave him one last nod. And then, everything happened at once. The young man lunged forward. His hand shot out like a whip, fingers clawing for the strap of Margaret's purse. The motion was fast but clumsy, born of desperation rather than skill. Margaret gasped, her body jolting as the strap caught against her arm. She tried to pull back, but the force sent her stumbling off the seat. Her grocery bag fell, scattering milk, bread, and daisies across the floor. The sound of her cry cut through the car like a blade. Passengers flinched but didn't move. Fear froze them in place. One man turned away, pretending to look at the window, though there was nothing to see. Another whispered to his friend, "Don't get involved." The college girl near the back had her phone raised now, her hand shaking as she recorded the chaos. The entire car had become a theater of stillness, an audience paralyzed by their own uncertainty. Keanu stood. There was no hesitation, no noise, just a single movement that felt deliberate and final. His coat shifted as he rose, the air around him tightening. The thief yanked harder, breaking the purse free from Margaret's grasp. She fell to her knees, clutching her wrist in pain. The purse hung from his hand like a trophy. For a brief second, the young man locked eyes with Keanu again. He expected outrage or anger, but saw neither. Keanu's expression was unreadable calm, centered, but filled with something far heavier than rage. A quiet authority, the kind that didn't need words to command attention. The young man took one step back, gripping the purse. His chest heaved with adrenaline. The train jolted again as it sped forward, the lights flickering violently overhead. Shadows rippled across the walls like ghosts. Margaret's breath came in shallow bursts. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Please, give it back." The thief's lips parted, but he didn't answer. His companions tensed, waiting for his next move. Keanu's hands rested loosely at his sides, but every muscle in his body was ready. He felt the familiar rush, not fear, but purpose. The same clarity that came in moments when instinct overruled thought. He knew that if he didn't act now, the night would end with someone hurt far beyond a stolen purse. The car rattled. Time seemed to slow, and Keanu took his first step forward. The moment Keanu stepped forward, the air in the subway car shifted. The tension that had been swirling like invisible smoke suddenly condensed into something sharp and real. The young thief froze, caught between instinct and the weight of Keanu's calm advance. The train rocked slightly, but Keanu's balance never wavered. His movements were smooth, deliberate, controlled. Margaret remained on the floor, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She clutched her wrist, which had begun to swell. Her groceries lay scattered across the aisle, flowers crushed underfoot, milk leaking slowly from a torn carton, bread half out of its bag. Her frail body trembled, but her voice, when she spoke, carried quiet dignity. "Please, young man, I just want to go home." Those words hit harder than any shout could have. The young thief's jaw tightened. His grip on the purse faltered for a fraction of a second, but pride and fear welded his fingers back around the handle. The two men behind him urged him on with subtle gestures. They wanted him to bolt toward the next car, to finish what he'd started. Keanu raised one hand slightly, palm open, not in threat, but in calm restraint. "Stop," he said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the full weight of certainty. The tone was neither angry nor afraid, it was steady, almost compassionate. It was the kind of voice that made people listen, even when they didn't want to. The thief's chest heaved. His heart raced so fast, he could feel it in his throat. For a moment, he looked no older than a scared teenager, trying to decide between running and crying. The stillness of the car magnified everything: the hum of the rails, the shallow breaths of onlookers, the faint creak of Keanu's boots against the floor. Then the train jerked again, and that brief moment of hesitation vanished. The thief turned and bolted down the aisle, shoving past a man in a business suit. The purse swung from his hand, colliding against a seat. The two other men jumped to follow. Keanu moved before thought could catch him. One stride, then another, closing the distance between them. The car erupted into motion, people gasping, some shouting for help, others backing against the walls. Margaret tried to pull herself up, her voice trembling as she called out, "Someone, please." The thief reached the end of the car, grabbing at the door handle to the next compartment, but it wouldn't budge while the train was in motion. He turned, panicked, and there was Keanu, now only a few feet away, steady as stone. The young man's face crumpled into panic, his breath ragged. He clutched the purse tighter, his eyes darting for escape. But there was nowhere left to go. Keanu's voice came again, low and certain. "That's enough." For a long second, the sound of the train drowned out everything: the thundering of the wheels, the hiss of metal, the heartbeat of fear pounding through the car. The young man stood cornered, at the end of the aisle, breathing fast, clutching the purse like a shield. His eyes flicked from Keanu to the doors, then to his friends, but they had stepped back. They knew the situation had changed. The calm stranger before them wasn't an easy target. Keanu closed the last few feet between them. He didn't rush. Every movement was measured, deliberate, like a man walking toward a fragile truth. His expression stayed unreadable. The thief raised his hand in warning, but it trembled. His other hand still held the purse, its contents spilling slightly Margaret's wallet, a photograph, a few coins rolling across the floor. "You don't want to do this," Keanu said softly. The words were simple, but they carried the force of something deeper, an understanding. He wasn't speaking to a criminal. He was speaking to a soul on the edge. The young man's lips parted, but no words came out. His throat constricted with panic. He was shaking now, not from defiance, but from shame. The flickering lights caught the glisten in his eyes as he tried to steady himself. "I didn't mean to," he muttered, voice cracking. I needed." Margaret's faint cry reached them from the floor. "Please, son, give it back." That broke something inside him. The thief looked down at the purse, then back at Keanu, as if waiting for permission to surrender. For a brief instant, he considered dropping it and running, But Keanu's presence left no room for chaos. There was only stillness, and in that stillness, a quiet demand for the right choice. But fear can twist even the smallest moment of clarity. Behind the thief, his friend hissed, "Go! Move!" A sharp, desperate whisper. Startled, the young man swung the purse toward Keanu, more in panic than aggression. Keanu reacted with precision born from instinct. He stepped aside, caught the thief's wrist, and turned it gently but firmly, twisting the momentum away without violence. The purse slipped free and fell to the floor. The thief stumbled, his balance gone, and crashed against a seat. Keanu didn't strike him. He simply stood there, holding the purse by its strap, breathing steady. The car fell silent again, the danger dissipating as quickly as it had begun. Passengers stared, awestruck. No one spoke. The moment hung in the air, heavy with relief and disbelief. Margaret's hand trembled as Keanu bent down and returned the purse to her. "It's all right now," he said quietly. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes, whispering, "God bless you." And as the train raced toward the next stop, Keanu straightened, his gaze shifting toward the young man now slumped against the wall. The night had changed course, and so had every life inside that subway car. The train thundered onward through the dark tunnel, its lights flickering just enough to illuminate the scene. Keanu stood between the thief and the rest of the car, his body still, his presence commanding. He wasn't angry, but there was something in his eyes that froze everyone in place, a calm, unwavering strength. The young thief had stumbled backward into the corner, panting, his hands trembling as he tried to steady himself. The purse lay on the floor between them, the strap torn, coins scattered across the aisle. Margaret sat nearby, one hand over her heart, still catching her breath. Her voice quivered as she whispered, "Please don't hurt him." The plea carried a tone only a mother could have compassion, even for the one who had caused her pain. Keanu didn't take his eyes off the young man. His voice was low but steady, clear enough for everyone to hear. "That's not yours." It wasn't a command. It wasn't even an accusation. It was truth, spoken without anger. The words landed heavier than a shout could have. The young man's chest rose and fell rapidly. He stared at Keanu, eyes narrowing as if trying to understand who this stranger was, why he wasn't yelling, why he wasn't striking back. The others in the car were silent. The two men who had encouraged the theft stood a few rows away, frozen, unwilling to step in now that the balance had shifted. The college girl lowered her phone, her recording forgotten. The businessman who had turned away before now looked straight ahead, shame visible in his face. Every pair of eyes in that car was fixed on the quiet confrontation. The young man swallowed hard. His voice broke through the silence, rough and defensive. "You don't know what it's like, man. You don't know what I'm dealing with." His tone wasn't hateful, it was wounded, exhausted. The desperation that had driven him was now unraveling in his voice. Keanu didn't move closer, but his gaze softened. "I don't need to know," he said quietly. "You can still make this right." For a moment, the thief looked down, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. His reflection in the window looked smaller, younger, lost. The flicker of light made his face look even more hollow. He wasn't a hardened criminal. He was a kid, caught between shame and survival. The train lurched again, shaking the car. Margaret's groceries slid slightly across the floor. Keanu's feet stayed planted. The sound of the rails filled the silence as the young man's eyes darted toward the door, then back at Keanu. The fight inside him wasn't about escape. It was about pride, about admitting defeat in front of strangers. The air between them felt fragile, suspended on the edge of something irreversible. The sound of the train wheels clattering against the tracks filled the silence like a heartbeat. The car's passengers barely breathed, afraid that even a whisper might shatter the fragile calm. Keanu stood still, his shadow stretching across the aisle under the flickering light. The young man's chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, his face caught between anger and confusion. He wasn't expecting mercy, he was expecting a fight. Keanu's tone remained level, his voice carrying over the hum of the rails. "You can stop this right now." There was no threat, no judgment, just quiet conviction. The kind that came from a man who'd seen pain and knew what it could do to people. The young man laughed nervously, though it came out more like a gasp. "Stop it? You think it's that easy?" His voice cracked as he spoke. "You think I want to do this? You think I like this?" He took a step forward, then hesitated, glancing toward the others in the car. His friends avoided his gaze now. They were no longer with him. Fear had taken their courage. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Please, son," she said gently, her trembling hand reaching out. "Let it go. Don't make it worse." Her words hit him harder than Keanu's presence had. He froze, swallowing hard. His eyes darted toward the purse on the floor, then back to her. He looked so young in that moment, like someone's lost child who'd taken a wrong turn too far to find his way back. Keanu took one careful step closer, his expression calm. "Listen to her," he said softly. "She's giving you a chance. Take it." The young man shook his head, his jaw tight. "You don't understand," he whispered. "If I walk away with nothing, I'm dead anyway." The despair in his voice was raw. The words hung heavy, and suddenly, the crime made sense. This wasn't greed, it was survival gone wrong. Keanu's eyes softened, but his stance didn't change. "There's always another way," he said. "This isn't it." The young man's shoulders slumped slightly. His hands shook at his sides. The whole car seemed to exhale, but the tension still hung in the air, unbroken. The lights flickered again, bathing them in harsh flashes of white and shadow. Keanu could see the battle inside the boy, the fear, the pride, the hunger, and the regret. It was all there in his trembling frame. Slowly, Keanu reached down and picked up the purse, setting it gently on the nearest seat instead of holding it like evidence. "You can walk away right now," he said, voice steady. "No one's stopping you." For a moment, the boy stared at him, stunned by the offer. No accusation, no violence, just mercy. The train screeched around a curve, metal grinding against metal. It felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what choice would be made next. The subway lights steadied as the train began to slow, the low rumble softening into a deep, mechanical hum. The young man's face glistened with sweat. His eyes darted from the purse on the seat to Keanu, whose calm demeanor never wavered. Every movement from Keanu seemed deliberate, measured like someone who'd seen chaos before and learned how to tame it with silence. Margaret shifted slightly, pressing a hand to her chest. Her breathing was shallow but steady now. "Please," she whispered again. Her tone wasn't one of fear anymore, it carried pity, even love, for the broken youth before her. The young man finally spoke, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "You think I want to be this?" His lip trembled, and his words spilled out fast, almost trembling. "My mom works nights. My brother's sick. We've got nothing left, man. I'm just trying to keep him alive." His eyes glistened, his defenses slipping away. "I didn't want to hurt her, I swear." Keanu took another slow step forward. "Then don't," he said quietly. "You can still make a different choice, right now." The boy's fingers flexed at his sides, restless, uncertain. He looked around at the faces, watching him, ordinary people, scared but compassionate. None of them looked like enemies anymore. His jaw tightened, and he turned back to Keanu. "You don't even know me," he said, his voice low, defensive. Keanu shook his head gently. "I don't have to. I know you're better than this. I can see it." For a long second, the boy said nothing. The words seemed to hang in the still air of the train, finding their way into the cracks of his conscience. He blinked hard, his body shaking as though he were holding back tears. Slowly, almost painfully, he nodded toward the purse on the seat. "I didn't mean to scare her," he muttered. I didn't see another way." Margaret's trembling hand reached forward again. "It's never too late to start over, son," she said softly. The boy's throat tightened. He took a step forward and gently pushed the purse toward her with the back of his hand. His head bowed. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The entire car seemed to exhale at once. Keanu didn't smile. He simply stood there, his calm presence still holding everything. Steady. That's the right choice, he said. His tone was quiet, almost fatherly. Now stay still. Let's get you help before this goes any further. As the train screeched into the next station, the hum of brakes filling the air, the young man's hands rose slowly in surrender. He looked broken but relieved, like a weight had finally lifted. Keanu turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the car. For the first time that night, people looked at him not just as a stranger, but as something more, a force of peace in a place that had forgotten it. The screech of the brakes echoed through the tunnel as the train slowed, metal grinding against metal. For a brief second, everyone thought it was over. The young thief stood still, his chest heaving, hands half raised, his apology still trembling in the air. Keanu's stance softened slightly, though his eyes stayed locked on the boy, making sure he didn't bolt. The quiet in the subway car was fragile, a thin film of peace stretched over a world that had been seconds away from breaking. Then, the balance shifted. One of the thief's companions at the far end of the car shouted, "Run!" It was sharp, desperate, and it snapped the young man back into panic. His head jerked toward the sound, his pulse spiking again. In an instant, fear took over reason. He lunged toward the door, trying to push past Keanu. The motion was sudden, but Keanu moved faster. His reflexes, honed by decades of discipline and training, kicked in instinctively. He caught the young man's arm mid-swing and twisted just enough to redirect his momentum without harm. The boy's body turned sharply, his back hitting one of the poles. The sound was loud, but Keanu's hold was firm, not violent. He wasn't fighting to hurt him. He was fighting to stop him. "Calm down," Keanu said evenly. "You don't have to make this worse." The young man struggled, his breath coming in gasps. His body thrashed, trying to break free, but Keanu's grip was precise, controlling rather than punishing. Every movement had purpose, his hand pressing the shoulder to keep him stable, his other arm securing the wrist. He used leverage, not force, guiding the chaos instead of meeting it with aggression. Margaret, still sitting on the floor, flinched at the sudden motion. Her groceries lay around her like fragments of the life she had nearly lost. She clutched the side of a seat for support, her eyes wide as she watched the confrontation unfold. The other passengers began to stir, voices rising in murmurs. A few people shouted for help. Others stood frozen, their faces pale under the fluorescent light. Phones came up, capturing shaky footage of what was happening. A teenage boy whispered, "That's Keanu Reeves." His voice filled with disbelief. The train rocked again as it entered a curve. The struggle between calm and chaos mirrored the movement of the car. The young thief, though smaller and weaker, fought with the frantic energy of fear. But Keanu's composure never broke. He held his ground, breathing steady, eyes focused. It wasn't a movie set. There were no cameras, no retakes. Yet, in that moment, the man who had played so many heroes became one in the most human way possible by refusing to let anger guide him. The train car trembled as the struggle continued, its motion syncing with the rapid rhythm of tension filling the air. The young thief tried to twist away, pulling against Keanu's grip, his sneakers sliding helplessly on the slick metal floor. Panic consumed his movements, wild, uncoordinated, desperate. But Keanu stayed anchored, his stance wide and firm, his expression focused but not angry. "Let me go," the thief shouted, his voice cracking. His eyes darted toward the window, toward his friends, toward anywhere he could escape. But Keanu didn't yield an inch. He tightened his hold just enough to keep control, careful not to inflict pain. "You need to stop," he said, his tone calm but absolute. "It's over." The two other men at the far end of the car hesitated. They had urged him to run, but seeing Keanu Reeves holding their friend in a steady grip froze them. They exchanged glances, realizing this wasn't going to end the way they thought. One of them muttered a curse under his breath, then stepped back, blending into the corner as if the walls might hide him. Margaret's voice trembled as she cried out, "Please, stop fighting." She was still on the floor, reaching out with a shaking hand, but her words were swallowed by the sounds of the train and the scuffle. A passenger stood up near the center of the car, uncertain whether to help or to stay out of the way. "Should we call the police?" someone whispered. Another voice answered, "I think they already did." The murmurs grew louder. Fear, awe, confusion, they all mixed together into one tense hum that filled the space. Keanu shifted slightly, adjusting his hold. The thief pushed again, harder this time, trying to jerk free. Keanu responded with a simple redirection, twisting his own body in a way that forced the young man to lose balance without falling. The motion was clean, effortless, something born from experience, not aggression. The thief's arm went limp for a moment, his body recognizing the futility of the fight. Phones were everywhere now. Dozens of eyes watched, recording the real-time drama as it unfolded. Some whispered his name, others gasped as they realized who he was. "It's him," someone said under their breath. "It's Keanu Reeves. He's actually stopping him." But Keanu didn't hear them. Or if he did, he didn't care. He wasn't performing. His focus stayed entirely on the young man before him, his breathing steady, his grip unwavering. "I'm not your enemy," he said softly. "You're not a bad person. You just made a bad choice." The thief's eyes darted up, meeting Keanu's. For the first time since the chaos began, his body went still. There was something disarming in that voice, something that reached through the noise and found what little was left of his conscience. The thief stopped struggling, his chest heaving, his arms still locked gently in Keanu's grasp. The fight had drained from his body, replaced by the heavy weight of realization. The sound of the train filled the silence again, steady and unrelenting, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Keanu's eyes met his calm, unwavering, filled not with triumph, but understanding. "Breathe," Keanu said quietly. "You're okay." His tone carried no trace of threat, only a firm steadiness that cut through the chaos. He loosened his grip slightly, enough to show trust but not enough to risk escape. The young man's shoulders slumped. He exhaled a shaky breath, eyes glistening with exhaustion and shame. Across the aisle, Margaret clutched her purse close again, her frail hands trembling. She looked at Keanu, her eyes full of gratitude and disbelief. To her, he looked almost unreal, a man who had stepped out of the ordinary world to defend what was right, without anger, without violence. She whispered, "Thank you," her voice breaking, though she wasn't sure if he heard. The two accomplices at the end of the car tried to slip away quietly, inching toward the door, but passengers noticed. Someone shouted, "Don't let them leave!" Another person raised their phone higher, capturing their faces. One of the men cursed under his breath and backed off, knowing it was too late. This wasn't a job anymore, it was exposure. Keanu gently guided the young thief to a nearby seat. The boy's breathing slowed as he sank into it, his hands trembling in his lap. He didn't look at anyone. The adrenaline that had carried him moments ago was gone, leaving behind only emptiness. A murmur spread through the car. People whispered in disbelief, their phones still raised, capturing a real-life act of courage that felt more like a movie. One woman near the back began to cry softly, overcome by what she had just seen. The college girl lowered her phone and simply watched, tears welling up in her eyes. Keanu glanced around, ensuring everyone was safe. His eyes landed on Margaret again, then on the spilled groceries. Without a word, he knelt and began gathering what he could. The bread, the scattered coins, even the crushed flowers. He placed them back gently in the bag and handed it to her. She took it slowly, her lips trembling. "You're an angel," she whispered. He shook his head. "Just a man on the right train tonight." The train began to slow again, the overhead speakers crackling. Next stop, 110th Street. A new kind of silence filled the car. Not of fear, but of awe. As the subway screeched into the station, passengers turned their eyes toward Keanu, some clapping softly, others too stunned to speak. He didn't respond. He just looked back at the young thief, who now sat hunched over, hands covering his face. The night wasn't over yet, but the moment that would define it had already happened. The train rolled to a slow crawl, the metallic rhythm echoing through the tunnel. Inside, the silence felt electric, fragile, but alive. For a long moment, no one spoke. Every passenger was frozen in place, still processing what they had just witnessed. The subway had gone from chaos to calm, from fear to reverence, in the space of a heartbeat. Then the whispers began. Soft at first, like a tide building under the hum of the rails. "That's Keanu Reeves," someone said, half in disbelief. He stopped him. A woman near the back covered her mouth with her hand. "I thought someone was going to get hurt," she whispered to her husband. He handled it like it was nothing. The young thief sat slumped in the seat, head bowed, his wrists resting loosely in his lap. He was no longer struggling, but shame rippled through his body with every shallow breath. Keanu stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on the seat rail, his expression composed and unreadable. There was no anger in him, no self-satisfaction, just quiet vigilance, as if his only concern now was that no one else got hurt. A few rows down, a father shielded his young daughter's eyes. "Don't look, honey," he said softly. But she peeked anyway, her small voice barely a whisper. "Is he a superhero, Dad?" The father smiled weakly, unsure what to say. "No," he murmured. "He's just a good man." The college student with the phone continued filming, her hands shaking. She zoomed in on Keanu's face, the faint reflection of the overhead light catching the calm in his eyes. It wasn't a scene from a movie, but it felt cinematic, all the same, raw, real, and deeply human. Every person in that car was now part of a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. Margaret, her voice still trembling, broke the silence. "He didn't mean it," she said softly, looking at the thief. The boy raised his head, startled. "You don't know that," someone whispered, but she ignored them. "He's young, scared. I can see it." She turned her eyes toward Keanu. "You see it too, don't you?" Keanu nodded faintly. "I do." His tone carried both gravity and grace. He looked down at the thief, whose lips trembled as if he wanted to speak but couldn't. The moment felt suspended, in time a quiet standoff between guilt and mercy, fear and forgiveness. Then someone in the corner began to clap. Just one person, timidly at first. Then another joined. Within seconds, the car filled with the sound of soft applause. Not loud or celebratory, but reverent. Keanu didn't react. He wasn't there for praise. He simply gave Margaret a reassuring glance and stayed where he was, watching over the boy until the next stop arrived. The applause faded into murmurs again, replaced by a hushed awe that filled every corner of the car. The sound of the train echoed beneath it, a reminder that the world was still moving. Even in this suspended moment of humanity, Keanu remained motionless, his presence grounding the uneasy passengers. The thief glanced nervously at the people around him, guilt washing over his features, as he realized what he had become. In their eyes, not a threat anymore, but a broken young man, exposed by his own fear. A middle-aged woman near the center of the car spoke up. "That's how you do it," she said quietly, shaking her head. "No yelling, no violence, just control." Her husband nodded beside her. "He could have hurt that kid," he said, "but he didn't. He kept everyone safe." Keanu's expression softened. He wasn't listening for praise, but he felt the weight of every word. It reminded him of why he acted the way he did, not to be admired, but because he couldn't stand still when someone was in danger. Margaret, now sitting again, wiped at her eyes with a trembling hand. The purse sat on her lap, its torn strap draped over her fingers. She looked at Keanu with quiet gratitude. "You were so calm," she said, her voice small but clear. "You didn't even raise your voice." Keanu looked back at her and offered a faint, comforting smile. "There was enough noise already," he said softly. The young thief shifted uneasily in his seat, the words landing heavy in his chest. His hands fidgeted, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I wasn't gonna hurt her," he muttered under his breath. but it was loud enough for those nearby to hear. I didn't know what else to do." The college student lowered her phone. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "You almost did something you'd never forget," she said quietly. The boy looked up, startled by her sincerity. "He stopped you before you lost yourself." That struck something in him. His breathing slowed, and his eyes found Keanu's again. The older man's expression was still steady, but there was no judgment there, only understanding. "You've got time to turn it around," Keanu said, "but it starts with taking responsibility." The boy swallowed hard, nodding slightly, though tears began to form at the edges of his eyes. He didn't try to wipe them away. Across the car, a young man in a work uniform spoke up. "You saved her, man." That was. He stopped mid-sentence, realizing words didn't do justice to what he'd seen. "You did what nobody else could." Keanu shook his head again, quietly. "Anyone could," he said. "They just have to decide to." The line lingered in the air, simple but powerful, settling deep in the hearts of everyone who heard it. The train began to slow as it neared the next station, the faint voice of the conductor announcing the stop over the intercom. But inside the car, no one moved. It felt like time itself had paused, holding the passengers together in an invisible thread of shared emotion. People looked from Keanu to Margaret, then to the young thief, unsure whether they had just witnessed justice, mercy, or something greater than both. The young man wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed. He wasn't crying out of pain, but out of release. The tension that had held him captive for weeks, maybe months, had finally cracked. His chest heaved as he muttered, "I didn't mean to. I swear." Margaret's soft voice answered him, trembling but sincere. "You have a chance to start over, dear. Don't waste it." Her hand shook slightly as she reached out toward him. He hesitated, then slowly extended his own, not to shake hers, but just to meet her halfway. For a brief, fragile moment, their fingertips touched the woman he had frightened and the man she had forgiven. A few passengers wiped their eyes quietly. The father who had shielded his daughter earlier now looked down at her. She was staring at Keanu in awe. "He helped without being mean," she whispered. The father smiled faintly. "That's called real strength." The college girl who had been filming lowered her phone completely now, realizing the story no longer belonged behind a screen. She wanted to remember it differently, not as content, but as proof that compassion still existed in the world. Keanu remained silent, still standing between the thief and the crowd. He could feel their eyes on him, but his attention stayed on the young man, who sat slumped in quiet remorse. The two accomplices in the corner didn't dare move anymore. One of them whispered, "Let's just get off." But Keanu's calm gaze flicked their way, and they froze where they stood. The train jolted as it stopped. The doors opened with a hiss, letting in the cold air from the platform. Nobody got off. Even those whose stops had come and gone couldn't bring themselves to leave yet. They wanted to see the moment through. A man in a security uniform entered from the next car, alerted by the commotion. "What's going on here?" he called. Several passengers pointed toward the thief, speaking over one another. But Keanu raised a hand gently. "It's under control," he said, his tone steady. "No one's hurt." The guard blinked, then recognized him. "Wait, you're..." He trailed off, too stunned to finish. Keanu simply nodded, signaling toward Margaret. "She needs help first." The guard hesitated, then nodded back and approached her, helping her gather what was left of her belongings. Margaret looked up at Keanu with a tearful smile, whispering, "Thank you again." Keanu gave a quiet nod, his voice soft. "You're safe now." And as the doors closed again, the passengers' eyes lingered on him, some recording, some whispering, but all united in silent awe. The screech of the subway brakes broke the silence like a cry of relief. The train slowed, sparks flashing briefly outside the windows as the wheels locked against the rails. People swayed in their seats, hands gripping metal poles as the movement came to a stop. The doors opened with a sharp hiss, and cold air rushed in from the platform. For a moment, no one moved. The passengers sat frozen, still caught between shock and disbelief. Then, the echoes of footsteps filled the platform heavy. urgent, purposeful. Two police officers rushed through the doors, hands hovering near their belts, their voices cutting through the murmurs. "Everyone stay calm, what's going on here?" The young thief lifted his head slowly, eyes wide and glassy. He didn't resist. His body was limp, exhausted from fear and shame. Keanu stood beside him, calm and steady, one hand lightly resting on the metal railing, the other open and empty to show he wasn't a threat. "He's the one," said a man in a business suit, pointing toward the boy. "He tried to rob that woman." Margaret flinched at the sound of the accusation. "He gave it back," she said softly. Her voice shook, but her eyes were full of compassion. "He didn't hurt me. He just lost his way." The officers glanced at each other. They had been prepared for violence, but what they found instead was something quieter, something that didn't fit the call they'd received. One of them approached carefully, his flashlight beam brushing across the car, landing on Keanu. For a brief second, recognition flickered in his face. "Wait," he said under his breath, disbelief softening his tone. "Is that—" Keanu gave a small nod, his expression calm but firm. "It's under control," he said. "He's not going to run." The officer blinked, still processing the surreal sight before him. Keanu Reeves, standing in a half-lit subway car, holding the aftermath of chaos together with nothing but quiet authority. He lowered his flashlight. "Sir, can you step back, please?" Keanu nodded once and released his hold on the thief's shoulder, stepping back without hesitation. The boy didn't move. His head hung low, shoulders slumped as the officers gently took hold of his wrists. There was no struggle, only the quiet sound of handcuffs clicking shut. The second officer picked up Margaret's torn purse from the floor and handed it to her. "Ma'am, is this yours?" She nodded, her hands trembling as she took it. The cracked leather seemed heavier now, as if carrying the weight of the entire night. "Yes," she whispered, clutching it to her chest. Her lips quivered with relief. "Thank you." Keanu's eyes softened as he watched her. The way she held the purse wasn't about money or belongings. It was about dignity, about feeling safe again. The other passengers looked on, still whispering his name like it was part of a prayer. The first officer guided the thief gently toward the exit. "You're lucky, kid," he said under his breath. "Not everyone gets a second chance like this." The boy didn't reply. He just nodded faintly, stealing one last glance at Keanu before stepping off the train. As the officers escorted the young thief out onto the platform, the tension that had gripped the train for nearly half an hour began to ease. The passengers exhaled almost in unison, the collective relief spreading through the car like a warm current. Some were still filming, others sat stunned, but all were united in one quiet truth. They had just witnessed something remarkable. Keanu stepped back toward Margaret, who was still seated, clutching her purse with both hands. Her frail fingers trembled, but her eyes shone with gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "You could have gotten hurt." He smiled gently. "Sometimes doing the right thing means taking a risk." His tone was simple, steady, the words falling into the air like something practiced not for a camera, but for a life lived with purpose. The older woman's eyes filled with tears. "If my husband were alive, he'd thank you himself," she whispered. "He always said there were still good men in the world." Keanu lowered his gaze briefly. "He sounds like one of them." Around them, people began to murmur again. The businessman who had pointed earlier now looked embarrassed. "I should have helped," he said quietly to his wife. "I just froze." She touched his arm, whispering, "You did what most people would do." The college girl who had been filming looked at Keanu, then slowly put her phone away. She didn't want to turn the moment into a viral clip anymore. Instead, she said softly, "You changed how I see things. I hope you know that." Keanu didn't answer, only offered a small nod. He wasn't interested in fame or praise. The thought of it made him uncomfortable. To him, this was never about heroism. It was about humanity. The kind that asked for no reward, no recognition. The officers re-entered the car, confirming that the situation was secure. "He's in custody," one of them said, his tone professional but tinged with awe. "We'll handle it from here." Then, almost hesitating, he added, "Thank you, sir, for keeping everyone safe." Keanu simply replied, "I'm glad no one was hurt." His voice carried the weight of someone who meant it. As the officers moved to gather witness statements, passengers continued to approach Margaret. A young mother handed her a new cloth bag for her groceries. A man picked up the fallen bouquet of daisies and offered them to her again, the stems bent but still beautiful. Margaret smiled through her tears. "Thank you, all of you," she said, her voice shaking. "I'll never forget this night." Keanu helped her stand, steadying her gently by the arm. She was lighter than he expected, her frame fragile, but her spirit seemed unbroken. Together they stepped onto the platform, where the flickering lights of the station gave everything a faint golden glow. As they walked toward the exit, people called after him, "We love you, Keanu. You're a real hero." He didn't turn back. He just raised a hand in quiet acknowledgement and continued walking beside Margaret until she was safely in the care of the police. Behind them, the train doors closed again. The rumble returned, and the subway rolled onward into the dark, carrying a story that would spread far beyond that single night. And for everyone who had been there, it wasn't just about the star they recognized. It was about the man who had reminded them what courage looked like when it was silent, simple, and true. The platform was nearly empty now, the noise of the departing train fading into the distance. Margaret stood unsteadily near the tiled wall, her hands trembling as she tried to steady her breath. The events of the last few minutes still lingered in her body like an echo, fear, relief, disbelief, all tangled together. The officers were speaking quietly nearby, but Keanu's attention stayed on her. He knelt down beside her, his movements gentle, patient. "Take your time," he said softly. His tone was calm, warm. The same steady voice that had silenced chaos just moments earlier. He gathered the grocery bag at her feet, rescuing what he could from the scattered items. The bread was dented, the flowers slightly crushed, but Margaret looked at them as though they were treasure. "I thought I'd lost everything," she whispered, clutching her purse. "Not just the bag, everything. My faith in people, my sense of safety." Keanu smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting with quiet empathy. "You didn't lose that," he said. "You just got reminded it's still here." He stood and extended a hand to help her up. She hesitated for a second, then placed her trembling palm in his. His grip was firm but kind, steadying her as she rose to her feet. Her eyes glistened as she looked at him, the flickering station light reflecting off her tears. "You could have walked away," she said, voice breaking. "You didn't even know me." He shook his head. "We're supposed to help each other, that's all." His words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind of truth that didn't need to be profound to matter. Margaret took a shaky breath, adjusting her scarf. The world around them seemed to move slower now. Passengers were leaving the station, some glancing back at the sight of Keanu Reeves helping an elderly woman gather her things. A few had their phones out, taking pictures quietly, but the moment wasn't about fame or spectacle. It was about humanity, one person lifting another when she had fallen. Keanu picked up the fallen bouquet and brushed the dirt from its petals. "Still good," he said with a small smile. He placed it back into the bag, tucking the flowers so their yellow centers faced upward again. Margaret laughed through her tears, a sound small and shaky, but full of life. "Those were for my husband," she said softly. "It's his birthday today. I visit him every year." Keanu's expression softened further. "Then we'll make sure you still get there," he said. He offered his arm. She took it without hesitation. The motion was slow, almost ceremonial, an image of compassion so pure it silenced the murmurs around them. As they began to walk toward the exit, cameras flashed quietly in the distance. The flashes from cell phones sparkled briefly along the edge of the platform as Keanu and Margaret began to walk, their steps slow but steady. The officers who had taken statements stepped aside to let them pass. No one spoke for a moment. They just watched the two figures moving together, the movie star guiding the frail woman who had nearly lost everything. The contrast between them was striking, yet their connection felt natural, effortless. Margaret's hand trembled slightly against Keanu's arm. Her breathing was still uneven, the adrenaline of fear giving way to the fragile calm that follows it. "I'm sorry you had to see that," she said quietly. "The city can be cruel sometimes." Keanu shook his head. "The city's just people," he said. "And tonight a lot of people showed who they really are. Some were afraid. Some froze. But everyone wanted it to end peacefully. That's what matters." She nodded slowly, taking comfort in his words. "You speak like someone who's seen a lot," she murmured. "I've seen enough to know that kindness doesn't happen by accident," he replied softly. They reached the stairs leading toward the main level. The steps seemed steep for her small frame, so Keanu adjusted his pace, letting her lean on him. She clutched the railing with her free hand, determined but cautious. Every few steps, he looked down to make sure she was steady. "You remind me of my son," she said between breaths. "He used to help me up the stairs like this before he moved away. I haven't seen him in 3 years." Keanu smiled faintly. "Then tonight you're not walking alone," he said. "You've got help." The words brought another tear to her eye, and she pressed her lips together to keep from crying again. They reached the top of the stairs, where a cold wind blew through the corridor. The night outside was calm now, the chaos of moments ago replaced by the hum of distant traffic. A few reporters had gathered at the entrance, alerted by social media posts. They whispered as they saw him, cameras rising instinctively. But Keanu ignored them. He wasn't there for a headline. His focus remained on Margaret, who was trying to fix her scarf against the wind. He gently lifted it from where it had come loose and adjusted it around her neck. "You're very kind," she said, looking up at him. "I wish the world had more people like you," he smiled, humble and sincere. "The world has plenty," he said. "They just don't all make the news." Her laughter was soft but genuine this time. "You really are a good man," she whispered. He glanced toward the exit, noticing a taxi waiting near the curb. "Let's get you home," he said. He carried her groceries as if they were made of glass, careful not to crush the flowers again. The officers followed at a respectful distance, ensuring she got safely into the car. Before she entered, she turned back one last time. Her eyes glistened under the station lights. "Thank you," she said, "for reminding me that there's still good left in people." Keanu gave her a small nod. "You're safe now, Margaret. That's what matters." The cab door closed, and the car pulled away slowly, leaving him standing beneath the glow of the streetlight. The world felt quiet again. Around him, strangers lingered at a distance, watching the man who had turned an ordinary night into a story of grace. He didn't speak to the cameras. He didn't wave. He just walked toward the next stairway that led deeper into the city, disappearing back into the place where ordinary life continued, leaving behind only a memory of quiet courage and an image that would soon travel the world. By the time Keanu stepped out of the station, the world outside was no longer quiet. The cold night air carried a low hum of voices, phones ringing, and camera shutters clicking. The streetlights glowed softly against the pavement, reflecting the yellow haze of New York's midnight calm. Yet among the usual noise of the city, one story was already beginning to travel like wildfire. A group of passengers stood near the exit, their faces pale but animated. A young man in a delivery uniform was the first to speak to a local news crew that had arrived minutes after the commotion. "I was there," he said breathlessly. "I saw everything." He didn't even think twice. 1 second, the thief grabbed the purse. The next boom, Keanu had him stopped like it was nothing. But he wasn't rough. He was calm, like he'd done this his whole life. Another passenger, a college student still holding her phone, nodded eagerly. "It was like watching a movie," she said. Only this time, it wasn't pretend. He didn't act like a celebrity. He acted like a protector. Her voice shook with emotion, and she blinked rapidly as if replaying the scene in her mind. Nearby, a middle-aged woman with tears in her eyes spoke softly into a reporter's microphone. "He helped her like she was family," she said. "When everyone else froze, he just moved." There was no anger, no panic, just goodness. I'll never forget it. The cameraman zoomed in on her trembling hands as she clutched a crushed bouquet of daisies she had picked up from the floor after the scene. "He gave these back to her," she added. "He even brushed the dirt off the petals." Onlookers passing by began to stop and listen. Some hadn't seen it, but had already heard whispers from inside the station. "Keanu Reeves stopped a robbery," someone said into their phone. "Yeah, on the subway. There's videos. It's all over Twitter." Within minutes, posts began flooding social media. Clips taken from passengers' phones spread across platforms, short, shaky videos showing Keanu standing tall in the subway car, his voice steady, his hand extended toward the young thief. Some videos captured his quiet words, "That's not yours." Others ended with him helping Margaret gather her groceries. Every frame painted a portrait of calm strength. Comment sections exploded. "He's the real deal," one user wrote. "You can tell he wasn't doing it for attention." Another read, "In a world full of noise, Keanu keeps showing what true class looks like." News outlets picked up the story before dawn. Headlines began to appear on screens in coffee shops and taxi radios across the city. "Keanu Reeves stops subway robbery without violence." Hollywood's gentleman hero strikes again. From the silver screen to real life, Keanu protects passenger in NYC. But for the people who were actually there, it wasn't just a story, it was something they felt. A reminder that kindness still had power, even in the most unlikely places. As the night deepened, more witnesses came forward, each telling the story in their own words. A father who had been riding with his young daughter spoke to a local radio reporter. "You never expect to see something like that in real life," he said. "Everyone froze. My little girl was scared. Then this man, this calm, quiet man, stood up and handled it. No shouting, no fighting, no fear, just control." It was like watching peace itself step into chaos. His daughter tugged on his sleeve and added shyly, "He told the bad man to stop." And he did. Her voice was small, but the simplicity of her words said everything. Another commuter, a nurse on her way home from a late shift, gave her account. "He was sitting a few seats down from me," she recalled. "He looked so normal, just tired, like everyone else. But when it happened, something in him switched. He moved fast, but with care. He didn't hurt that boy. He just stopped him. Then he spoke to him like a father would." I've never seen anything like it. Across the city, televisions flickered with footage from the subway, edited and replayed by morning news anchors. The clip showed Keanu holding the young thief steady, his posture protective rather than aggressive. One commentator said, "In an age when confrontation usually turns violent, Keanu Reeves just demonstrated what real composure looks like." Another added, "He didn't need to play a hero, he simply was one." By sunrise, the story had reached every corner of the internet. Hashtags like #SubwayHero and #Keanu the Protector began trending worldwide. People reposted the footage with captions like, "Proof that goodness still exists," and, "In a world full of chaos, be like Keanu." Yet amid the viral attention, Keanu was nowhere to be seen. While reporters camped outside his hotel and fans crowded his social media pages, he remained silent. He didn't make a statement or appear in interviews. Instead, those who knew him best said this was just who he was, someone who believed in quiet action, not public praise. At the corner near the station, a small crowd gathered around the steps where it all happened. Margaret's name had begun circulating online, and people left flowers at the entrance, many of them daisies, like the one she'd carried, a handwritten note taped to the base. Railing read, "For Margaret, because you reminded us that even in fear, there can be grace." A young reporter covering the scene looked up at her cameraman and whispered, "It's strange, isn't it? Usually when we cover subway stories, it's about tragedy, but tonight, it's about hope." The cameraman nodded, and one man made it happen. Later that morning, a local paper ran the most shared headline of the day. "He didn't just play a hero, he showed us one." Beneath it was the now famous photo of Keanu walking Margaret up the station stairs, her arm looped through his, the crushed bouquet in his hand. For millions around the world, That image became more than a picture. It became a reminder that real heroism isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It just shows up when it's needed most and leaves quietly once the work is done. By the next morning, the news had already turned from shock to investigation. Reporters who had initially focused on Keanu's bravery began digging into the background of the young man he had stopped. His name was Darius Miller, 22 years old, from the Bronx. The mugshot that appeared online showed a face that looked more frightened than defiant. Eyes sunken from sleepless nights, jaw clenched, not with anger, but with shame. It didn't take long for the story behind the crime to emerge. Darius had once been a promising student at a vocational school, studying mechanics. His teachers remembered him as bright and eager to learn. But 2 years ago, his mother was diagnosed with severe heart disease, and the family savings vanished into medical bills. When she passed, he dropped out, taking odd jobs to care for his younger brother. He worked nights at a warehouse until the company downsized and let half their staff go. The eviction notice came 3 months later. Since then, Darius had been sleeping on a friend's couch, bouncing between part-time work and day-old food pantries. He'd been looking for help that never came, applying for jobs that no one called back about. His life had narrowed down to survival. When asked why he'd done it, he reportedly told police, "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I just needed something, anything to eat. To keep my brother fed." The words made headlines, not because they excused the crime, but because they revealed the tragedy beneath it. Keanu read the article later that morning while sitting alone in his hotel room. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, cutting across the newspaper on his lap. The photo of Darius stared back at him, a face too young to already look defeated. He set the paper down, thinking back to the look in the boy's eyes during the confrontation. It hadn't been malice, it had been fear. The kind of fear he'd seen in people who had lost everything. He thought about how easily the world turned its head from stories like Darius's until they exploded in desperation. To the public, the event was simple: hero stops thief. But to Keanu, it wasn't that black and white. The truth was layered, complicated, and deeply human. He couldn't stop thinking about what Darius had said in the heat of that moment, how he just wanted to keep his brother alive. Keanu leaned back, staring at the skyline beyond the glass. New York pulsed below him, millions of lives intersecting, some thriving, some breaking. He had seen pain before, both on screen and off, but this was different. This was the kind of pain society ignored until it forced its way into the light. That afternoon, more details surfaced about Darius's life. A local community center director spoke to a reporter about him. "He came here a few times looking for work," she said. "He wasn't bad. He was lost. There's a difference. He wanted to do right but didn't see a way out." Her words painted a fuller picture, one that resonated with anyone who had ever faced the edge of hopelessness. Social media, which had spent the night celebrating Keanu's bravery, now began to split. Some argued the boy deserved punishment. Others said he needed help. The conversation shifted from heroism to humanity. News anchors debated what it meant to live in a society where desperation could drive someone so young to crime. Through it all, Keanu stayed silent. He didn't want the story to become about outrage or pity. What mattered to him was the lesson hiding behind the noise. Later that evening, as he walked through Central Park to clear his thoughts, he found himself replaying the moment on the train over and over. The fear in Darius's eyes, the trembling in his voice when he said, "I didn't mean to." Those words had stayed with him longer than the applause or the headlines. Keanu thought about his own life, about the times when loss had nearly hollowed him out. The people who had reached for him, even when he couldn't ask for help. Maybe Darius had never had that. Maybe the world had stopped reaching before he learned how to stand on his own. The next morning, Keanu asked his assistant to find out where Darius was being held. He didn't want to interfere with the law, but he wanted to understand more. Through quiet channels, he learned that Darius had been placed in a holding facility while awaiting a hearing. The officer who spoke to Keanu over the phone said something that stuck with him. "He's not like the usual ones we see," the man said. "He's quiet. keep saying he messed up, that he wants to start over. Keanu stared out the window after the call, watching the city wake up below. "Start over," he whispered. The words felt heavy. He knew how fragile that opportunity could be, how easily the world forgot those who'd fallen behind. That afternoon, an online article appeared quoting one of the officers who had made the arrest. "Reeves treated the suspect with more dignity than anyone I've seen in 20 years on the job," it read. He didn't see a criminal, he saw a human being. The quote went viral within hours. For Keanu, it wasn't about becoming a symbol. It was about what came next for Darius, for everyone like him. In a private statement to a community outreach program, Keanu donated funds to support job placement and housing assistance for at-risk youth in New York. He didn't announce it publicly, but the organization later confirmed it anonymously, saying, "A certain Good Samaritan wanted us to help others before they reached desperation." When a reporter asked Keanu days later if he forgave the young man, he simply replied, "There was nothing to forgive. We've all been lost at some point. Some of us just have better maps." The interview aired late that evening, and viewers across the country paused at that line, because behind it wasn't a rehearsed quote. It was a truth spoken from experience. For Darius, his story was no longer that of a thief. It became the story of a second chance, the kind sparked not by punishment, but by compassion. Within 24 hours, Keanu Reeves' name was everywhere. The story that had begun as a quiet act of courage inside a dim subway car had erupted into a national sensation. Morning shows ran the footage on repeat, framing it with headlines that glowed across the screen. "Keanu Reeves saves elderly woman in subway robbery." "Hollywood hero turns real-life protector." Clips of the confrontation flooded social media, spliced into dramatic montages with slow music and captions like, "A real hero walks among us." Talk show hosts opened their broadcasts with admiration. One anchor said, "You expect this kind of thing in a movie, but not in real life." Yet Keanu Reeves proved again that character doesn't end when the cameras stop. Another smiled at the camera and said, "He's the kind of man America needs right now, humble, fearless, and kind." By afternoon, hashtags were trending worldwide. Number Keanu the Protector, number Subway Hero, and number America's Gentleman Hero. Fans posted artwork, memes, and messages thanking him for restoring their faith in humanity. Some shared their own stories of kindness, inspired by what they'd seen. Others simply wrote, "Thank you for reminding us what real courage looks like." But as the noise grew louder, Keanu grew quieter. His publicist fielded calls from every major outlet. Talk shows wanted exclusive interviews, magazines wanted cover shoots, and producers wanted commentaries. Some offered generous donations to charities in exchange for a statement, but Keanu declined them all. His only public message was through a brief note released by his team. "I'm grateful everyone is safe. Please focus your attention on helping those who are struggling, not on me." That single sentence became its own headline. News anchors called it a masterclass in not humility. An editor from The Times wrote, "In a culture obsessed with spectacle, Keanu Reeves reminds us that decency doesn't demand a spotlight." While the internet dissected every frame of the viral video, Keanu slipped away from the noise. He took a long walk along the Hudson that night, his hands in his coat pockets, his mind still heavy with the image of Darius's hollow eyes. The applause of the world felt distant, unreal, compared to the reality he'd seen in that boy's face. He stopped near the water, where the city lights shimmered across the river. Around him, people were talking about him, without realizing he was only a few feet away. "He's a legend," one man said to his friend. "No scandals, no arrogance, just pure heart." The other replied, "He doesn't even seem human sometimes, like he's from a better world." Keanu smiled faintly but didn't say a word. He wasn't from another world, he'd just learned how to hold on to goodness in this one. That night, as the internet exploded with praise, Keanu's apartment remained dark and silent. The world saw a hero. He saw a reminder of how fragile people really were. The next morning, the media storm reached full force. Every major network aired special segments about Keanu's act of courage. Morning hosts smiled into their cameras, praising his restraint and calmness. In a world full of chaos, one commentator said, Keanu Reeves reminds us that heroes still walk among us. Clips of the incident were replayed across channels. Keanu standing between the thief and the passengers, his hand raised, his expression steady. Slow-motion edits emphasize the moment he helped Margaret gather her groceries, the flowers cradled gently in his hand. Audiences across the world were captivated. Even people who had never seen one of his movies began sharing the story, touched by his quiet example. Paparazzi began camping outside his residence, hoping for a, quote, a photo, or even a wave. Cameras clicked whenever he stepped outside, but Keanu gave them nothing more than a polite nod before disappearing into his car. When asked about the attention, his publicist told reporters, he's thankful people are inspired, but he didn't do it for attention. He just helped someone in need. Still, the attention refused to fade. Late-night comedians mentioned him in their monologues, calling him the only man in Hollywood who saves people on screen and off. A news anchor ended her broadcast saying, in a time when so many stories divide us, this one brought the world together for a moment. Fans from around the globe began leaving flowers at subway entrances, many accompanied by handwritten notes. For the hero who stayed humble, thank you for showing us how to be kind. But Keanu didn't see himself that way. To him, it wasn't heroism, it was instinct. Something that came from his belief that doing good shouldn't need witnesses. He avoided reading the articles or watching the videos. When friends tried to show him, he simply said, I'm glad she's safe. That's all that matters. In private, though, he couldn't help but think about what the story had become. The world loved simplicity, good versus bad, hero versus villain. But the truth was far more complicated. Darius wasn't evil, just broken. Margaret wasn't weak, just scared. And he, Keanu, wasn't perfect. He was just someone who acted when others froze. That night, a journalist managed to catch him outside a charity gala and asked, Mr. Reeves, how does it feel to be called America's gentleman hero? He paused before answering. The flash of cameras reflected in his eyes, but his voice was calm, almost weary. I don't think anyone's a hero for doing what's right, he said. We all have moments where we can choose to help. That's what makes us human. The clip aired on every network by midnight. It wasn't dramatic or rehearsed. It was quiet, sincere, and deeply moving. The next morning, talk shows dissected his words, calling them the most honest thing said in months. The quote spread faster than any video. People reposted it with captions like, be more human and do what's right, even when no one's watching. By the end of the week, the frenzy began to shift from excitement to reflection. News outlets started running opinion pieces, not just about Keanu's kindness, but about the lack of it in the world. One columnist wrote, maybe we celebrate him so much because we see what we've lost the courage to care quietly. Keanu didn't read that one either. He was already on a flight out of New York, his phone off, his mind somewhere else. For him, the story had never been about fame or headlines. It had been about a single moment in a subway car when one frightened woman needed help and one desperate man needed mercy. That was the only version of the story he cared to remember. 3 days passed before Keanu found the courage to visit Margaret. The city had begun to move on from the headlines, but he couldn't. Her face still lingered in his mind, the mix of fear, grace, and gratitude that had defined that night. He'd asked one of the officers for her contact information, explaining that he wanted to make sure she was all right. With her permission, he arrived at her small apartment on a quiet street in Queens one late afternoon. The building was old but cared for, with flower pots on the windowsills and a hand-painted sign in the lobby that read, "Be kind to the neighbors." Keanu smiled when he saw it. It felt fitting somehow. He climbed the narrow staircase, his footsteps echoing softly. When he knocked on the door, it opened slowly, revealing Margaret in a light blue cardigan, her silver hair tied neatly back. For a moment, she simply stared at him, eyes wide. Then she laughed a warm, shaky laugh that filled the tiny hallway. "You actually came," she said. "I promised I'd make sure you were all right," Keanu replied, his tone gentle. "May I come in?" She nodded quickly and stepped aside. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with framed photographs and the faint scent of chamomile tea. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the worn wooden floor. "Please, sit," she said, gesturing toward a small table near the window. "I was just making tea." Keanu hesitated. "You really don't have to." "Oh, hush," she said with a smile that carried both authority and kindness. "A hero deserves at least a cup of tea." He smiled softly at that, but didn't argue. The kettle whistled, and she poured the tea carefully, her hands steady despite her age. When she set the cup in front of him, she sat opposite, her posture straight, her eyes studying him with quiet curiosity. "I've had a lot of visitors," she said after a pause. "Reporters, neighbors, people I haven't spoken to in years. They all wanted to hear about the famous actor who saved me." She paused, looking down at her tea. "But none of them asked how I was doing." "Not really." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's why I came," he said, "to ask." Her eyes softened. "I'm doing better. My ribs are still sore from the fall, but I'm healing. The doctor said I was lucky." She smiled faintly. "I told him I had help from someone who knew how to catch trouble before it got worse." Keanu's smile was modest, his gaze lowering to the teacup in his hands. "You were brave," he said quietly. "You didn't give up." Margaret chuckled. "Maybe not, but I did need help that night. You gave me more than I can ever repay." Margaret took a slow sip of her tea before setting the cup down gently. "You know," she said, "I've lived in this city my whole life. I've seen it change, seen people change. It's faster now, colder too. That night on the train, I thought the world had finally forgotten people like me. But then you stood up." Keanu looked at her with quiet sincerity. "Anyone would have done the same," he said softly. She shook her head, smiling knowingly. "No, not everyone. People were scared, and I can't blame them. But you weren't. You didn't even hesitate." Her eyes grew wet, glimmering in the golden light that poured through the curtains. "You didn't just save my purse. You gave me something back I thought I'd lost. You gave me my dignity." The words settled in the air between them, heavy and tender at once. Keanu didn't speak. He only nodded, the emotion visible in his eyes. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "You deserve to be treated with respect. That's all." Margaret smiled, her voice trembling. "You remind me of my husband," she said. "He used to say things like that. He fought in Vietnam, came home different but still kind. He passed 15 years ago, but I still feel him here sometimes. I think he would have liked you." Keanu leaned back slightly, his gaze softening. "He sounds like a good man," he said. "He was," she replied, looking toward a framed photo on the shelf, a younger version of her husband smiling in uniform. "He used to believe that one small act of courage could change everything. I used to believe it too, but somewhere along the way, I stopped, until that night." Keanu followed her gaze to the photo, then back to her. "He was right," he said quietly. "Courage isn't about big moments. It's about what you do when no one's watching." Margaret reached for his hand, her touch warm and fragile. "You must have had someone teach you that," she said. "Someone who raised you well." He paused for a moment, his expression reflective. "My mother," he said softly. "She worked hard, never complained, and always reminded me to look out for others. She used to tell me that kindness doesn't make you weak, it keeps you human." Margaret smiled gently. "Then she did a fine job." The clock ticked softly in the background as the two sat there sharing quiet stories. The world outside buzzed with its usual noise, cars passing, horns in the distance, but inside her little apartment, time felt slower, simpler. After a while, Margaret stood and retrieved a small tin of cookies from her counter. "I don't have much to offer, but these are homemade. I make them every week, just to feel useful." She handed him the tin with both hands. Keanu accepted it carefully, his eyes soft with gratitude. "Thank you," he said. That means a lot." She nodded. "You've done more for me than you'll ever know. And I don't mean saving me from that boy. You reminded me that there's still goodness in the world, and that's something worth waking up for." Keanu smiled, his eyes glistening slightly. "You've reminded me of that too," he said. As he stood to leave, she walked him to the door. "Promise me something," she said quietly. "Don't ever stop being that kind of man. The world needs you." He paused, meeting her gaze with gentle sincerity. "I don't think I could stop, even if I wanted to." They shared a brief embrace, brief but genuine, filled with the kind of connection that needed no words. Then, he stepped into the hall, leaving her with the same warmth he had brought that night on the train. Inside, Margaret looked down at the empty teacup and smiled. For the first time in years, the city felt kind again. That night, long after his visit with Margaret, Keanu walked through the quiet streets of Manhattan. The city that never slept was finally still, its lights flickering against wet pavement left behind by an evening rain. The sound of distant sirens echoed off the buildings, but around him, there was peace. He pulled his coat closer, hands in his pockets, his mind heavy with thought. He had seen countless scripts about heroism, stories of courage, sacrifice, and redemption. But standing under the dim glow of a streetlight now, he realized that real heroism didn't follow a script. It wasn't written with grand speeches or perfect timing. It lived in the ordinary seconds when no one was watching and no one expected you to move. He stopped at a small park bench overlooking the East River. The wind off the water carried the faint hum of traffic from the bridge above. He sat down, letting the silence settle around him. In his mind, the moment replayed again: the thief's trembling hands, Margaret's frightened eyes, the crowd frozen in uncertainty. For a heartbeat, he had felt the same fear they did. The only difference was that he refused to let it decide for him. He wondered what made people hesitate in moments like that. Was it fear of danger or fear of getting involved? Maybe both. But he also knew that courage didn't mean the absence of fear, it meant moving forward despite it. Keanu thought of Margaret's words earlier that day. "You gave me dignity back." They echoed softly in his head. He hadn't set out to restore anyone's dignity, but maybe that's what courage did. It gave people back something the world had taken from them. He looked up at the skyline, the city's reflection shimmering on the water. So many windows, so many lives, each one carrying its own quiet battles. Maybe some of those people had seen the news, watched the video, read the stories. Maybe they were thinking differently now, just as he was. What if, the next time someone saw injustice, they didn't freeze? What if one small act, one moment of decency spread beyond the subway car and into the hearts of thousands? The thought made him smile. He didn't believe in being anyone's savior, but he did believe in the power of example. He rose from the bench, walking slowly toward the street. His steps echoed softly, mingling with the hum of the city. For the first time since that night, he felt a quiet peace, not from the praise or attention, but from knowing that perhaps something good would outlive the noise. He stopped near the corner of the block and looked back once at the river, its rippling surface reflecting the lights like scattered stars. Heroes didn't always wear capes. Sometimes they just stood up when it mattered most. Keanu turned down a quiet street lined with trees whose bare branches reached like black lace against the night sky. His footsteps echoed softly, keeping rhythm with the whispering wind. The city lights faded as he wandered farther from the crowded avenues, seeking the stillness that had always helped him think. Every story he had ever acted, and the ones about strength, loss, redemption, all seemed to blur into this one real moment. What defined a hero? He asked himself that question again and again. It wasn't fame or skill. It wasn't the ability to fight or win. It was something quieter. The courage to do the right thing even when no one else did. The strength to care when indifference was easier. The humility to act without expecting applause. He remembered the look on the passengers' faces that night in the subway. Some were terrified. Some wanted to help but froze. Others simply didn't know what to do, and he understood them. Fear was powerful. It made people forget who they were for a moment. But courage could be contagious too. If one person acted, maybe others would next time. He thought of Darius, the young man whose desperation had sparked it all. Society had already judged him, but Keanu couldn't bring himself to. The world liked simple stories, heroes and villains, but life wasn't that neat. Sometimes the villain was just someone trying to survive. And sometimes the hero wasn't fearless at all, just unwilling to ignore the pain in front of him. A gust of wind swept through the street, carrying with it the faint smell of street food from a nearby vendor. Keanu smiled faintly. It reminded him of the smallness of life's simple comforts. Food, warmth, kindness. They were things people fought for, in different ways. He walked until he reached a small cafe that was closing for the night. Through the window, the barista was wiping down tables, humming softly. He paused to watch her for a moment, appreciating the normalcy of it. Not every day had to be extraordinary. Sometimes being good meant showing up, working hard, and treating others with decency. The bell above the door jingled softly as he entered. The young woman looked up, startled for a second, then smiled shyly. "We're just about to close," she said. "That's all right," he replied gently. "Just a coffee to go." As she prepared it, the muted sound of the television behind the counter caught his attention. His own face was on the screen again, the footage from the subway, looping silently. The words beneath read, "Keanu Reeves, humility in action." He looked away, a little uncomfortable. When the barista handed him the cup, she hesitated. "I saw what you did," she said softly. "My mom sent me the video. She said it gave her hope." Keanu smiled kindly. Then maybe it was worth it. He paid, thanked her, and stepped back into the cold. The street was nearly empty now, the glow of lamplight soft on the wet pavement. He took a sip of the coffee and breathed in the night air. Somewhere, someone was still struggling. Somewhere, another Margaret was writing home, another Darius was losing hope. He couldn't change the whole world, but maybe he could inspire people to try to notice each other, to act with empathy instead of fear. As he reached the corner, he stopped beneath a flickering streetlight and looked up at the vast night sky. A hero, he thought, is just someone who doesn't look away. He took another step forward, disappearing into the quiet rhythm of the city, content not with being seen, but with having done what was right when it mattered. The seasons turned, and New York shifted from winter's chill to the bright promise of another spring. A full year had passed since that night in the subway, a night that had begun with fear but ended with something far greater. Time had moved forward, as it always does, but for the people touched by that moment, its echoes never faded. Margaret was thriving. Her doctor called her recovery remarkable. Her heart was stronger, her spirit lighter. Every morning she walked the short path to the nearby park, carrying the same bouquet of daisies she'd once clutched on the train. She always placed them at a small bench overlooking the pond, the same kind she used to visit with her husband. On the wooden slats of the bench, a tiny brass plaque had been added, in honor of courage and kindness. She'd smile each time she saw it, thinking of Keanu and how his calm strength had changed her life. It wasn't just about that night. It was about everything that followed. Neighbors who used to pass her silently now stopped to chat. Strangers smiled more. She had even joined a local senior group, something she'd never had the confidence to do before. They teased her gently, calling her the Subway Lady, but she wore the title with pride. On her small kitchen counter sat a framed photo, the image that had gone viral. It showed Keanu helping her off the train, her arm looped through his, the city lights behind them. She never bragged about it, but every time she looked at it, she whispered a quiet thank you, not to the fame, but to the humanity it represented. Meanwhile, Darius's life had taken an unexpected turn. After his arrest, the court gave him a chance at rehabilitation instead of prison, influenced by the compassion Margaret had shown. Her testimony insisting that he deserved a second chance moved even the judge. "He made a mistake," she had said in court, "but he's not a lost cause. He just needs someone to believe in him." Those words had changed everything. Darius entered a community rehabilitation program where he learned skills, attended counseling, and began rebuilding what he had nearly destroyed. It wasn't easy. Some days he thought about quitting, but every time he wanted to give up, he remembered the look on Keanu's face that night. It had been faith. Faith that he could still be more than the worst thing he had done. By spring, Darius had found a steady job at a local auto shop. His hands were always dirty, his pay modest, but for the first time in years, he could look in the mirror and see something other than failure. In his small apartment taped above his workbench hung a newspaper clipping of the story. He didn't read it for the fame. It was a reminder of the moment his life turned back toward the light. Darius often thought about reaching out to Keanu or Margaret to thank them, but he never did. He didn't know what he could possibly say that would measure up to what they had given him. Instead, he tried to honor them in the only way he knew how, by living differently. On weekends, he volunteered at the same community center that had once helped him find work. He would talk to younger kids who reminded him of himself, kids who were one mistake away from losing everything. "Don't wait until you're desperate to ask for help," he would tell them. "There are still good people out there. You just have to believe they exist." Sometimes, he'd catch his reflection in the glass as he locked up the shop at night and smile faintly. He wasn't proud of what he'd done, but he was proud of what he'd become. Redemption, he had learned, wasn't a single act, it was a daily choice. The story of that night had never really disappeared. It had become part of the city's folklore, passed from one person to another like a legend whispered over coffee or retold in classrooms as an example of compassion. Teachers used it in ethics lessons, journalists referenced it when talking about courage, and even subway operators mentioned it in passing when telling new recruits about the importance of staying calm in crisis. But the person at the center of it, the man who had made it all happen, remained silent. Keanu had returned to work, filming another project overseas. Despite the flood of interviews and invitations that followed the incident, he kept his distance from the story. His publicist said he preferred to let the world draw its own conclusions. When asked privately why he never spoke about it, Keanu simply replied, "It wasn't about me." Yet the experience had changed him in quiet ways. He found himself paying more attention to people, to small acts of kindness, to the moments when strangers helped strangers. He noticed how a single choice could ripple through countless lives. One morning, nearly a year after the incident, he received a letter at his home in Los Angeles. The handwriting was careful, but shaky. It was from Margaret. Inside, the note was short but heartfelt. "Dear Mr. Reeves, I wanted to tell you that I'm doing well. The doctor says I'm stronger than ever. I visit the park every morning, and I always think of that night, not with fear, but with gratitude. You changed more than just my life that day. You reminded me that goodness still walks this earth. With love and thanks, Margaret." Keanu smiled softly as he folded the letter. For a moment, he sat quietly at his kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the paper. He didn't need anything else, no interviews, no applause. Just knowing that she was at peace was enough. He looked out the window toward the city skyline and thought of all the unseen acts of courage happening every day. Moments that would never make the news, small kindnesses that would still change lives. That was what heroism really was, he realized. Not the story people told afterward, but the decision made in the instant before. That night, as the city lights flickered to life, Keanu took a walk down a quiet street. The world had already moved on, but the lesson of that night stayed with him. One act of compassion had spread far beyond that train car. It had saved a woman's dignity, rebuilt a young man's future, and reminded countless others that courage wasn't about strength, it was about heart. And though Keanu would never claim the title, the city had already decided for him. He wasn't just a hero of film anymore. He was the quiet hero of New York's subway legend. The man who taught the world that kindness, even in a moment of chaos, can outlive everything else. The city never remembered every face that passed through it, but some stories refused to fade. That night in the subway had become more than a fleeting headline. It had become a quiet legend of compassion, a story retold in countless corners of the world. A story that reminded people that heroes don't always arrive with noise and spectacle. Sometimes they appear quietly, act decisively, and then vanish without asking for recognition. Keanu never saw himself as one. To him, it had been a simple choice to help someone who needed it. But to the rest of the world, that moment had become a symbol. It was proof that humanity still had a pulse in an age where most people looked away. His silence afterward only made the story more powerful. People trusted the kind of man who didn't need to speak to be heard. A year after the incident, the viral videos had long since been archived, but their echoes still rippled through small acts of kindness across the country. In Los Angeles, a teenager helped an elderly woman cross the street after reading about Keanu. In Chicago, a bus driver stopped mid-route to protect a passenger being harassed. In Boston, a group of students started a project called Stand Up Anyway, a community movement inspired by one man's calm courage. The story had traveled far beyond what anyone expected. It wasn't about a purse or a subway robbery anymore. It was about the power of example, the undeniable truth that one person's action could awaken decency in others. Margaret's life had continued peacefully. She'd written another letter to Keanu that spring, telling him how her senior group had started volunteering at food banks in his honor. "You started something," she wrote, "and I think you'd be proud of it." Darius, too, had kept his promise to live differently. He had completed his rehabilitation and was working full-time, saving money, mentoring other young men who faced the same darkness he once knew. He didn't talk much about the night that changed his life, but sometimes, when he walked past the subway entrance where it all began, he'd stop and smile. He knew that moment had given him a second chance. And somewhere, walking through another city, Keanu remained the same, humble, quiet, still blending into crowds as if the world hadn't seen what he'd done. To him, kindness wasn't a headline. It was a duty. Keanu's act of compassion continued to live on not through his words but through the way people remembered how it made them feel. It had become a rare kind of story, one that crossed generations. Parents told it to their children before bedtime. Teachers used it in classrooms to talk about empathy. Even strangers online, who never met him, spoke about the subway moment like it was a mirror of something better we all wish to be. But Keanu never chased the legacy. He walked through life as quietly as he had that night, his hands tucked in his jacket, eyes soft, his mind turned toward the next person who might need help. Fame had long stopped meaning anything to him. What mattered now was living the kind of life that made others believe they could be decent too. Sometimes, when he traveled through New York again, he'd take the subway instead of a car. He'd blend in, unnoticed, headphones in his ears, sitting among ordinary people. The sounds of the train, the screech of the rails, the distant hum of conversation brought it all back. He didn't feel pride when he thought of it, only peace. It was proof that one simple act could change the course of many lives, even his own. He remembered the fear in Margaret's eyes, the trembling of Darius's hands, the silence of the crowd. He remembered how the world seemed to pause for a single heartbeat, and how he'd realized in that instant that being brave wasn't about being fearless. It was about seeing fear and choosing to step through it. Sometimes, he still wondered how many others might do the same if faced with a similar moment. How many people might find the strength to act not for recognition, not for glory, but because it's right. He didn't have the answer, but he liked to think that every person who watched that video, who heard that story, carried a small spark of courage because of it. The lesson wasn't about fame or fortune, it was about humanity. The quiet kind, the everyday kind. The kind that listens before judging, helps before asking, forgives before condemning. It was the kind Margaret had shown in court when she spoke for Darius. The kind Darius found again when he chose to rebuild his life. Keanu's story had simply been the match that lit their light. As the evening sun dipped behind the city skyline, Keanu stood at a crosswalk, watching people rush by. A man helped a woman pick up her dropped groceries. A bus driver waited patiently for an older passenger to find her seat. Two teenagers laughed as they offered their umbrella to a mother with a stroller. Small gestures, ordinary moments, but together, they painted a picture far more powerful than any movie scene. He smiled to himself. That was the world he believed in. Not perfect, but redeemable. He crossed the street and disappeared into the crowd. There was no music swelling, no applause, no spotlight. Just another man walking home after doing what felt right. And maybe that's what makes stories like his so lasting, because they remind us that decency isn't dramatic, it's quiet. It doesn't seek attention, but it has the power to shift hearts, one act at a time. In the end, the story wasn't about Keanu Reeves. It was about what we all carry inside us, the potential to be kind, brave, and human when it matters most. So, as the story fades into reflection, think about the people in your own life, the quiet heroes who've stepped forward when no one else did. Maybe it was a stranger who stopped to help, or a friend who stayed when others walked away. Have you ever witnessed an ordinary person become a hero? Share your story in the comments below. And if you believe that kindness still has the power to change the world, subscribe for more incredible stories of calm. Stories that remind us that courage doesn't need a stage, and heroes don't always wear capes.